What's going on, V.O.C. Nation? I just wanted to come on here and talk about how I think Florida State being left out of the college football playoff is one of the worst things I've ever seen in college football. It is horrible. Leaving out a 13-0 conference champion out of the playoff when there's two teams in there with a loss makes no sense to me. Yeah, you want to put the best four teams in the playoffs. I understand that. I want the best four teams in there so I can watch the best football in the new year. But we don't even have that. They didn't even put the best four teams in. If you want the best four teams, put in Georgia. They'd be favored against Texas and Washington right now. I guarantee it. And even Michigan probably. So put them in. This is coming down to your conference championships don't matter. There's not a Power 5 conference anymore. It's Power 2. SEC or Big Ten. Those are the only conference championships that matter. I mean, I don't understand how you can just say, oh, they're going to get smoked in the playoffs, so don't put them in. Okay, well, throughout the year, Michigan almost lost to Maryland. Washington State almost lost to Washington. Alabama needed a miracle to beat Auburn. So how can you tell me that anybody's going to get destroyed when we've seen way lesser teams with all losing records almost beat these teams? Florida State should 100% be in. They are undefeated, no losses. Texas and Alabama both have a loss. When have we ever done this? They let Cincinnati in. We knew they were going to suck. They let in TCU. We ended up beating Michigan, but do we leave TCU and Michigan out because we know they're both not as good as anybody else? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Third down
Welcome back, V.O.C. YouTube channel. Today with me, I have a very special guest. As you can see, I am joined by Jerry Hopkins, co-worker, friend, college football fan himself, Mizzou graduate, as they have done a very good surprise this year, and it's been very good. I mean, New Year's Six Bowl.
Yeah, I thought this year we were going to fire Drinkwitz, honestly, about 2 games in, especially after the Middle Tennessee State game. We looked terrible. The offense wasn't moving. Everything looked bad. And then we beat Kansas State, and this year got really weird in like the best way possible. So, yeah, now we get to play Ohio State, who I might actually opt out of the bowl game as well to be a Buckeye.
Well, I mean,
just, kind of join the trend.
that's like the biggest thing, right? It's like there's something brewing, and I seen a thing yesterday. I didn't want to believe it, but it was from a Michigan alum journalist. So this is why I didn't believe it. He was like, Ryan Day's shopping himself to NFL teams. That's why everybody's leaving. It's like, no, that's not why everybody's leaving. I think Ryan Day sees the writing on the wall, and I talked about it last week, was he needs a running quarterback. He needs a quarterback that can move. And, you have the Devin Brown kid who is the backup, who wears the funky number 33. He can move. And then you have the freshman coming in. I think it's Air Knoll or something like that's his name or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And he can run too. So it's like you kind of need that. And I think that's where Ryan Day's lost success in the Michigan game, since he's not had Justin Fields, is I don't have a running quarterback. So that will be interesting.
It will be. The Michigan team is good. I think one of the things about all of this is like, yeah, they haven't put up in the playoffs, but everywhere else, Michigan has shown up. And it's not that I'm becoming pro Michigan. The Block M schools, kind of have to stick together as much as we don't want to admit it. But like, they have talent too. You have guys like Blake Corum, McCarthy's all right? But they've played physical for the last couple of years, and they have a solid defense. And you see McCord go in the transfer portal, and it's like, yeah, he was a good quarterback. He wasn't great. And also, Ryan Day did not give him a lot of peace of mind when he goes in that press conference and goes, he might be the guy of the future. He's not backing him. So if I'm him, I'm a 5-star kid. I have a lot of good tape because I had some of the best receivers in the United States of America catching my passes. So you go from there. Day is really weird to me because he's a really good coach who's won over 90% of his games, but he's judged on one game, and he's failed in that one game continually. And it's not been, oh, you've lost on 3 field goals after 3 years. For 2 of those 3 years, you got dominated. This year was the closest game in a while, but remember the first time Michigan beat them after the long stretch? Michigan beat them up on the line. They looked stronger. They looked like a better team. Last year, they started to close the gap. Then this year, it was almost a coin flip. And the guy who didn't help you, the guy who's transferring now, it's a 5-star quarterback.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. It's like I was at the Michigan Ohio State game when they finally beat them. And it was one of those where it's like there was a lot of nerves going into it because it was like, oh, this is what's happened, the years past. oh, their offense, blah, 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 with Ohio State. And then Michigan's defense played them, and it was like, oh, shit, they can play with anybody, and granted, like it was cold, it was snowy, like, but still, it was one of those games where the physicality overcame Ohio State. And it's been such a dramatic difference from when Urban coached Ohio State and when Ryan Day's coached. It's been completely different, and it's not been, it hasn't helped them at all because physicality, it feels like, has left the program.
And they're starting to get that back with Knowles, I think, a bit. Their defense this year, and
Yeah.
what's been weird about Ohio State this year is that their defense can hit people. Like that defense is not afraid to mess around. I think their offensive line is not that bad, right? They're starting to get some of that back, but it took getting beat up in Ann Arbor to do it, which is crazy. And like we've seen that physicality. I remember that Georgia game just last year. Both of those teams could hit, and both of them were hitting. There
Yeah.
was not a lack of. It was not a pretty. It was a pretty game, but it was also not pretty at all. Right? Like those guys were playing a really physical ball game. I think that physicality is coming back, but Michigan built themselves around it, and that was their calling card. And you know what? For the most part, until you got to the playoff, they were going to beat the hell out of you, unless your name was TCU or Georgia. Where they decided, we're going to let that go, or we're so physical that no one can out physical us, and they got out physical twice, right? Like you've had this physical mindset really to beat an Ohio State team that offensively was the pretty boys of look at all the space our receivers have. Look how much the gap is for our running back. Oh, our running quarterback has 10 yards to gain because we have big guys, but really it's our offensive play calling and our play design, which is what Ryan Day at the end of the day is really good at, right? And like we saw that in that Georgia game, you gave him a month to play call, and he drew up some of the best plays we've seen from him as a Buckeye head coach. But week to week, that physicality, even if you go to California now as part of the Big Ten, has to happen because it still gets cold in these places. It still gets cold in Columbus. It still gets cold in Ann Arbor. Being able to run the ball and being able to physically beat some guys up really still does matter, even if you're starting to go coast to coast where it might be 50 or 60 degrees on a November day.
Well, that's what's interesting is like you look at all these offensive coaches, right? It's like Lincoln Riley and Ryan Day to me are in the same exact boat. Like they are the same exact coach. It's where it's like we just want to have flash, we want to be fast, we don't really care about physicality. It's the old Rich Rod model, and that's why Rich Rod didn't work at Michigan, right? It was like, you're going to score 48, well, I'm going to score 50. It's like that's not how you win. And you look at Michigan, it's like I think Jim tried to do that his first couple of years or in the middle there at Michigan, and he kind of lost success. And then he's like, no, I am a physical guy. This is what I did at Stanford. I took a program that was nothing based that on physicality, and we were great. And now at Michigan, where I can get better players, I'm going to do that same thing. And then you get the kids that fit the moxie and fit the bad guy mentality with until midway of the year, they weren't really the bad guys. Now they are, and they have a bunch of players that fit the bad guy mentality. So, and that I think that was the biggest thing when going to the Big Ten championship game, watching them play Iowa. You could tell that there is, and I am not the biggest Michigan fan. It's a team I hate the most, but you can tell that they have a moxie that they don't give a shit about what you say, what you do with them, and that starts with Jim. They're just wacky. They're there to play that role, and they don't care. And so now going into the playoff, and we can segue into that now, where Michigan is 1, Washington's 2, Texas is 3, and Bama's 4. It's they are, and since I'd say the last 4 or 5 weeks they've been the favorite betting wise, but now it's like okay, this is make or break, right? Because it is now the best team that Michigan's had probably since '97. And what are you going to do now? And I think it all goes back to pressure of, can Jim with a month and this pressure not do what he did last year where they started out the TCU game doing plays they'd never done all year, so that's what's going to be interesting now when you look at the playoff and how they're involved in it.
What I'm really curious with is will Jim Harbaugh and his players kind of learn their lesson when it comes to the playoff? It felt like every year when they get there, that first game, they are talking that mad shit. You're talking about that swagger they have. That swagger they have has helped them, right? It
Yeah.
is one of the reasons I think when they beat Ohio State and beat the hell out of them, you don't get the third base quote if you're just sitting there not having swag and talking your shit. Well, they talked their shit against Georgia, and Georgia pushed them in. They talked their shit against TCU. TCU wasn't supposed to beat Michigan, right? It was supposed to be close, but TCU kept that game going around. Are you going to, now I say shut up, right? but kind of go, the last 2 years we've come in with this brass, this swagger that we're going to win this thing all. And each of those games they've came out really flat, right, and have not looked like you said earlier, that team that played all year. They're trying new things. They're trying to do all this bullshit. Play your game, and in a way, just go out there and play ball. And especially with everything else, the sign stealing, Harbaugh suspended, we're crying on the sidelines after the Penn State win, all this stuff, right? There's every reason for them to talk that talk, because that's what, if you're in that bubble of Ann Arbor right now, you think that you're God's gift to the earth, and you're being persecuted and set to death, when really this is a subpar investigation by a guy who's a little too crazy, right?
Yeah.
But like the We're America's team, if they're going to do that type of stuff, you start favoring Bama, because they did that 2 years ago. They did that last year when they're the team that's going to run the damn ball, and then they got the damn ball ran on them, right? So, is Michigan going to come in here and just play football and stop talking that talk? Because the last 2 years they've talked that talk, and when they're in the first round, they've walked that walk and walked out of the stadium without a win. And I find that the most interesting, because this might be the last year of a Harbaugh-led program, especially with all the weird shit happening. I don't want to say that this is something that he needs to get fined $10 million for, or lose his job for. But if you're Michigan, if you keep having to go through the NFL carousel, where Jim Harbaugh is throwing his name out there for any NFL job, he wants to go back there at some point. And now you have the scandal where people are more just laughing at you and mocking you. It's not even the disgusting, bad, worst thing you've seen in the NCAA, but it's the, haha, Michigan was stealing signs. Haha, they had a crazy assistant. And you get to be a butt line of a joke for all that time. How much longer do you put up with him, even though he's winning you games and getting you to a spot you have not been for and been to really since, like you said, 97 or around that time?
Well, that's what's interesting. And I think a lot of the defending of Jim up to this point was so that he wouldn't leave. So it's like, we love you, we're going to give everything for you. We're going to be, we're going to be the school that puts up with you, because they want him to come back, right? I wore Bears stuff to the Michigan Iowa game because I don't care about both teams. So and a guy came up to me, he's like, "Hey, are you guys scouting your new coach?" And I joked with him like, "Yeah, I am." And then his buddy's like, "Well, we don't care if he leaves." And I'm like, "Yeah, you do. He is Michigan. If he leaves, you guys are nothing. He is Michigan football." I mean, there's very few players where it's like, very few people where they are a program. He is Michigan football, right? Aside from like Charles and Desmond, he is Michigan football. He is the grinder. He's the day-to-day guy. That's who Jim is. And it's very interesting how they've gone about it. And in the post game of the Big Ten championship, it felt like he was making a mockery of some things, in the way that he acted. And it kind of did act like, this might be my last ride here to be, you know what I mean? The way that he just kind of was, and the way that he feels. And now going into the playoff where you're now the number one team, right? It's like, there's not no more. It's like, okay, you got to get over Georgia. And that's the team, you are the team now. You know what I mean? The pressure is on you. So now that's going to be flipped, where you've had pressure, but you haven't had the pressure. And now you actually have the pressure on you as the number one team, the betting favorite going into it. You know, the expectation now where it's like, look, Alabama's in this playoff, so you have to be the one that defends for Florida State. You know what I mean? There's a lot of pressure going into this game, and you're going up against the greatest coach of all time and the greatest program of all time that we've seen the last 15 years. So it's just very interesting how this playoff, I think, unfolded from the rankings, and not just the controversy of Florida State, but just how each team going into it, there's kind of unknown with all of them.
And we have parity in college football right now. Not completely. It's not all the way down the line. Not all 133 have a chance, but you could have thrown almost 7 teams in that playoff, or even 8 damn near, and you would have felt pretty confident. The cutting line, as much as I hate to admit it, was Missouri at 9, right? That 2-loss team. But you had a lot of 1-loss teams, even in Ohio State. Your only loss is Michigan, right? And that was not even a 10-point loss. I think it was like 6. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was a close game, right? You have multiple undefeated. Florida State, they get screwed. Georgia, who was your number 1 all year and lost by 3 in a championship game, right? Oregon, yes, had 2 losses. Those 2 losses came to an undefeated Pac-12 champion in a Pac-12 that had multiple ranked teams throughout the year, right? It was constantly in the top 25. This is not the Pac-12 of the last couple of years where it's like, UCLA has 7 wins, we'll throw them in there, and Utah somehow has 9 wins. We don't know how they did it, right? You were going to Corvallis and all these places this year, and it felt different, partially because it's the last year and sentimental ties, but there's a lot of talent out on the West Coast this year. We're not used to it, and at least it hasn't been that way in a while. So you've had so many good teams, but in return, all these teams, there's no team that feels like last year's Georgia, where you're like, their biggest weakness is a multi-year starting quarterback who may not be the most agile, but he can still run the ball and he makes smart passes and he doesn't lose you games, right? You don't have those Alabama teams where they're so suffocating. It doesn't matter if me or you started at quarterback, right? Everybody has their flaws because you have more parity. And I don't know if that's NIL, recruiting, right? And all these other small things, but you have a lot of good teams, which then makes these games more interesting because no team is complete. Like the Alabama story is, I think, the most interesting in the playoff. You came in and you did not look like the better team against Texas. I know that was their only loss. They lost that game. That wasn't the flip a coin, one of these two teams wins. Texas looked like the better team, and they showed it in that game, right? And then they've gotten better. Alabama has. We were like, I remember at one point I was like, they're going to lose somewhere. They didn't. And that's partially Jaden Milroe getting better. That's the receiver core starting to step up as well, right? The defense kind of picking it up. So you've had for the first time in a while in Alabama a really well-coached team that's got it better, not this star-studded team that just didn't trip. And so you had, like, if you're Nick Saban, you're like, this is what I do it for. He's crazy. He's maniacal. I think he's had more fun this year with a one-loss team that he's made better than those years where he had so much talent that everyone else has looked around like, we can't beat that. We can't beat that. And now they're going to go play a Michigan team that has, we talked about at length, right, is America's team, has had all this pomp and circumstance around them. And quietly, for the first time in a while, Alabama's just kind of won a bunch of games and shown up. This is the loudest they've been all year, and it wasn't even their fault. And that's the craziest thing to say about Alabama football, because you're usually the people who make a lot of noise during the season.
Well, it's one of those teams, and this was one of my arguments for why I didn't think Florida State should be in the playoff. It's not where you start the season, it's where you finish. And Alabama has finished well. The last 5 weeks, everybody's been, this team's starting to pick themselves up. They're starting to look like themselves. Texas is a very good football team. Texas, on their best day, might be the best team in college football. Like that, and Alabama had to play that. So, that's one of those things. And I think Saban has had fun, and he's actually had to coach this year. He's actually had to get down, new offensive coordinator, somewhat new defensive coordinator, and figure it out and say, what are we going to be actually? And what do we do best? And, I think it's fitting that, he goes back to the Rose Bowl where he won his first national title. And that game was kind of, we're going to run the ball and be physical. And this team is kind of, we're going to run the ball, be physical, but every so often, Jalen Milroe can throw the ball 60 yards down the field, and we're going to do that too. So I think in Michigan, Ohio, in the Michigan-Alabama game, that's what's going to be the biggest thing is who can take those shots and who's going to win those shots. Michigan versus Iowa, they didn't take any shots. They just didn't, because it just felt like they knew that they were going to win the game, so they just went out there, just ran the ball. Every pass they threw was an out route pretty much. To where Alabama, they had to go out there and physically fight to win that game and prove something. So, the momentum, I think it feels differently going into that game. But no, without a doubt, it's, nobody's really talking about Alabama. They're only talking about Alabama because they feel like Florida State got screwed and Alabama got in. But on January 1st, about 8 o'clock, we could be talking about, well, Alabama getting in was the right thing because they just knocked off the number 1 team in the country.
Yeah, and this is where I get to make the point that Alabama got screwed, but also you're probably going to have a better game because of it. Like, or not Alabama, Florida State got screwed. My apologies there. Because Florida State, first of all, we have to talk about college football scheduling. I'm going to make this very quick because I can go on a lot of tangents. But you can't get mad at teams for scheduling 4 or 5 years out because that's the norm now, right?
Yeah. No, I didn't.
And then a team like Florida State schedules had a rivalry game, right? With Florida, you have to play that game. They play that game. You schedule another good SEC opponent, and the ACC's down, and you blame them for it. I know one of the big talking points, not just Jordan Travis, right, was their strength of schedule being in the 50s, where Alabama was in the top 5. Outside of the fluff game they had against North Alabama, really, right, it's not Florida State's fault that the ACC wasn't at its peak, that Clemson decided to be kind of mid, and that North Carolina didn't pull up to the billing. NC State decided to be good, right? But look at the state of the ACC with a lot of teams that hope to get to 6-6, and then maybe one or two that kind of sprinkle out. That's not Florida State's fault. On top of it, they didn't lose a game, and even against with some ugly opponents and some ugly wins, they won. So we're disincentivizing winning by putting Florida State at 5. Will we get a better game? Absolutely.
Well, yeah.
Alabama is talented. Michigan will have to dial it up. They're going to have to play their best game all year, if not on par with the Ohio State, if not better. In terms of a game. Does that mean, though, when we talk about the 12-team playoff next year, because this feels like a unique issue, because you'll have those conference ends and you have more spots, that what happens if Clemson loses 2 games and you have a 3-loss Oklahoma? Do we kind of fall in the same world? Maybe, right? So it's tough because, we have told a team that found a way to win, including a conference title game where things can get weird, and we have those moments, and that's a title that they took care of business in. And even if it was ugly, dominated a top 25 team in Louisville, physically. And we got to talk about physicality. Their defense is physical.
Yeah, no,
you don't hold Jamar Jordan
top
like that.
They have top 6 defense.
So yes, you lost your star quarterback. You also held a team that has dropped a good amount of points on teams, or at least has found a way to score more points than the other. So to what was it, 2 field goals or at least 1 touchdown? It was like 6 points last. It was like 6-16, right?
2 field goals,
that's a feat in its own right. Even if your offense didn't look like a top 25 offense because you're missing your senior quarterback, the fact that you have Jordan Travis out here going, man, I wish I would got hurt earlier. You know how crazy of a sentence that is to have
because it's
college kid saying out loud?
Yeah, you would have gotten a little more longevity of what does this team really look like. I think that this is my only argument that I would make for Florida State, because I don't think they should have gotten in, right? Like, I had no problem with the top 4 teams, and to me, those are the best 4 teams. To me, Georgia has a better argument to be in than Florida State. But when you look at, to me, Michigan and Florida State are very similar in the fact that they didn't really play anybody. Michigan had the 2 games at the end of the year with an overrated Penn State team. I mean, if Penn State played any other team in the top 10, they probably would have lost those games as well. So you have an overrated Penn State team, an Ohio State team that's good but not great, but you did beat them. But you beat them at home. You beat them by 6 points. It was kind of a dogfight until the 4th quarter. So it's very similar to be like if J.J. McCarthy goes down, would Michigan have been in or would they not have been in? You know what I mean? So it's like that would be my only argument for Florida State. And their non-conference was stronger than Michigan's. They beat LSU first game of the year, granted it's first game of the year, but they dominated them in that game. Florida was a 5-7 Florida team. It's just not the same as it were if it was a 9-3, 10-2 Florida team. But so I think that's what would be very interesting, especially with Washington and Michigan. You could throw them in with Florida State. If they lose their quarterback, what do we look at? Because with Michigan, it'd be like, well, they've been to the playoffs the last 2 years. They've been a good team. I think they would have gotten in. I think Florida State was just it's wacky to think about it, but I just think everything that could have went wrong for them went wrong for them. On the ACC is in the committee's mind is if it's not Clemson, it's not good. You're up against the SEC. You're up against a Texas team that beat technically the best SEC team. And then you have these 2 teams that in Washington and Michigan, where Michigan's proven it every year, and Washington, where they've beat Oregon, who the committee thought was a very, very good team, twice. So I just think the combination of everything was wrong for them, and it just unpiled at about 12:30 on Sunday. And, next year it's going to be an argument of, well, a 9-win LSU team or a 10-win Oklahoma team, right? So, and the other thing that nobody's going to talk about next year is that 12th team in the playoff is most likely always going to be a 1 loss or an undefeated non-Power 5 team. If Liberty would have been in the playoffs this year with the 12-team playoff, and they're playing Michigan in the first round. So that's going to take away from some of these Power 5 teams that, say you have a Notre Dame team 10-2, or you have an Oklahoma team that finishes 10-2 in the SEC. You know what I mean? That's going to be an argument.
It will be, and especially with the way the Power Five is slowly consolidating to the Power Two, those conference automatic ins. I actually don't know what it looks like now that the Pac-12 will dissolve by the time this starts. Right, that 12-team playoff actually starts, unless the Pac-2 gets an automatic bid. Which, congrats, Oregon State, you now have an easiest route to the
Automatic bid
playoffs known to
every year.
man. Congratulations. But like those conference tie-ins, I think will solve this specific issue where a conference champion gets screwed out. But yeah, you then this is where we want to talk about the SEC, this and that. This is where the SEC, and especially Greg Sankey's gone. The more spots you give us where it's not a guaranteed bid, we want that. They've always fought for that.
Well, he wanted a
Because they
12-team
know.
playoff this year. He fought for that this year, a 12-team playoff.
No,
He
yeah,
fought
but
for that.
and in it, he wants less conference ins because that
Yeah.
means for him, he knows that his conference right now will always win the benefit of the doubt. And that's what happened Sunday. Is Sunday he was vindicated in probably the most twisted way, with
Yeah.
knowing that, he's for years Sankey has fought for less ins from conferences because he knows if he has a really good Auburn team in 2 years, or that Auburn team that has 2 losses will probably get favored over the ACC team with 3 or the ACC team with 1 with a better resume on paper. And Sunday we found out he was kind of right. And while again, if we want to go by 4 best, I think that's totally fair. We've also given Cincinnati a chance, and there's been other times where I don't want to say the team with the least amount of talent because I was very pro Cincinnati getting in. They did everything right. They beat the teams they were supposed to. And yes, I think that was the year they beat Notre Dame. Notre Dame was really good, right? And they won their conference title, but they did everything right. So did Florida State. Florida State lost their best player and won twice. And then you said, hey, we know you did everything right, but even though in the past we've seen it go, you've done everything right, we'll let you scoot through. Because this is what invites, 2 or 3 lost teams with a lot of talent and 5-star recruiting rankings and, the teams that are on the top of 24/7 to get an advantage that if you're not as well coached, I don't care if you have a top 5 team. Miami might become the best program in the United States of America because they recruit their ass off even though they don't know how to kneel, right?
Yeah.
On a 4th down. Because they're always going to be in the top, 24/7, top 5, 10, 15, right? But Mario Cristobal can't manage a game to save his life. But if he has 2 losses and he has a couple 5 stars and not all of them get hurt, is that going to help sway them? Because that's what we kind of saw with Florida State being pushed out, was a team that is not as talented on paper, a team that, while perfect, didn't have the strongest strength of schedule. You had to say that 5 times fast. Got pushed out because the team looked better and because the committee said we wouldn't want to play Alabama. That is not what we've done in the past. And now we're going to set that precedent at the end of this, which will change how I think a lot of people talk about the sport. And I don't know if it's in a good way, even if your championship games are better. Because I know a lot of playoffs where the best teams got upset, not just in college football, in basketball, college basketball, NBA, NFL. Do we really feel like each year the best team wins in every single sport? No. That's what makes it special, is the guys who show up. You know how the world it would have been if Michigan blew it to Florida State without their quarterback?
No, it would have been massive. It would have been massive. But we'll never get that chance. Happen. I get that.
And for a team that didn't lose, didn't trip up, and was given a lot of places to trip up, they didn't. And we still said no. Or the playoff committee still said no because they didn't look the part. Even though the Noles have former playoff acumen and have gotten better each year, they didn't look the part because one guy got hurt and because they didn't destroy teams that rivalry week. Alabama was 4th and 31 away from losing to an Auburn team who lost to New Mexico State.
Yeah, no, I mean,
right?
Like I said, there's arguments.
Rivalry's weird. Yeah. And even though, again, I will totally be the first one to tell you these games are going to be better and it will be way more fun to watch and will be better entertainment and better football, you have sacrificed a lot of principle to put on a little bit better football. And that's kind of what, if the committee's okay with that, then that's the world we're going to have to live in.
Well, I think this year's, it was just interesting that there was this many teams that had a shot, right? There was 8 teams where you could probably legitimately have argued for those last 2 spots or that last 1 spot, right? It's, when Cincinnati made it, you know, they were undefeated. They had beat Notre Dame team, and there was really nobody else in contention, right? Like last year with Ohio State, there was really nobody else available, right? Alabama had 2 losses. They were a 1 loss, so I just think it was one of those years where, and this is where I think Greg Sankey's looking at himself and patting himself on the back is because he fought for the 12-team playoff. And he's someone that like looks at it and was like, if you were against that 12-team playoff, you look like an idiot right now. But we came out on top. And I think the other interesting thing is I don't know if it's coincidence or not that 2 of the teams that are in right now are going to be in the Big Ten next year, and the other 2 teams that are going to be in the SEC. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but it's very interesting to look at it and be like, well, moving forward to this 12-team playoff, yeah, there's more opportunities. But like you said, the SEC is going to get 4 or 5 teams in probably every year. It just feels like Georgia would have got in, Mizzou would have got in, Ole Miss would have got in, and there would have been a fight to get LSU in with Jaden Daniels at 9-3. And then the Big Ten is, Oregon could have been it. It's like you're going to have this fight where, yeah, we open up this expansion and the top 4 conference champs are going to get buys. Great. But there's going to be an argument saying next year, if Colorado becomes they're 8-4 as a Big 12 champ, they get a first round bye. People are going to be pissed.
With what we've lost as we consolidate conferences and consolidate power, basically, you lose a level of regionality that makes the intrigue go away at this time of year because you'll get better football. I think that's kind of, if you're just a football head way down, you just want to see, the best you can. The consolidation is the best thing that can happen because now you'll have your Oregon, Wisconsin game, which is weird, but yeah, you would have multiple playoff matchups happen throughout the year. Oregon, Ohio State. Of course, you'll get your Michigan, Ohio State, Washington, Michigan, right? Teams that are now, again, like you said, 2 teams in the Big Ten, 2 teams in the SEC, and they probably will play each other next year or get really close and have a lot of common opponents, which will make this part easy. This end of the year part will be way easier when you have common opponents, everything else can do, blah, blah, blah. You'll lose the intrigue that made this so much fun. The fact that we are arguing and you can have a consistent argument between me and you and across the college football world about Florida State and Alabama is what makes this thing special. It might be kind of stupid. I'm not going to act like this is all logical and everything that the NCAA does or college football does is logical. It's the exact opposite. But the fact that like next year Washington's just going to be kind of a cog in the Big Ten machine because you have so many good teams, instead of being the really cool Pac-12 team that is in Seattle and has this cool stuff and really can represent a region, right? That even a USC is its own real world, right? Yeah. But now it's just another Big Ten team, and that's weird to say. And while it's gonna, we'll get better football and the games you'll have more cool matchups, you're gonna lose a lot of what made this sport great. It's the fact that if I ever go up to East Lansing, I talk to you. I go, what do I need to know about a Michigan State football game? And those rivalries that make sense because you know what? Yeah, we might hate Wisconsin, let's just say, but they're also freezing their ass off because they're a Big Ten school.
Yeah.
UCLA ain't freezing their butt off this year, right? Like, you go to the SEC. I mean, in the SEC, it'll make a little bit more sense because you can argue Texas and Oklahoma have a little bit more of a better identity to the SEC than a lot of the transplants do to the Big Ten. It's still going to be kind of weird to say that Texas A&M Texas is an SEC game. That's a Big 12 game. And yeah, the conference.
Well, it'd be an old school Big 8 or whatever it was, the Sky 8.
Big 8 game,
for a lot of people, it's going to be that way.
What happens when SMU plays Arkansas? I know that that's an AC. SMU Arkansas is going to be an ACC SEC matchup.
Yeah.
That's a Southwest Conference game, right? Like, that's we have lost that. And while we'll start arguing conference bids in the future, conference bids would be so much more interesting with the 5 conferences existing, because then you would have more intrigue and fight within their own world because this is a regional sport. Yeah. And while it becomes more national, yes, you might get more eyeballs. And yes, if you're a TV executive, and I don't really love making the TV executive argument all the time, not that I work in TV, but it's because not everybody needs to think like one, right? But yeah, you'll get some better football that might get you some more eyeballs and some more immediate money. But the thing that made this really cool, like the color clashes and stuff like that will look normal. It will wear off, and then we'll have to find another way to make it interesting. So you keep running away from the thing that was interesting. Going to a place like Corvallis is weird.
Yeah.
That's what is fucking fun about college football more than anything. Ann Arbor's an interesting little Michigan town that only exists with a big house because Michigan showed up. South Bend, Indiana. I'm from the suburbs of Chicago. The only reason I know South Bend exists is because of Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Right?
No.
You could
It's the
pick
only
all these
reason
places.
that there's a map. You know what I mean? It's the only reason it's placed on the map.
You could pick so many places that have special college football programs, have a lot of history, that are either small, medium-sized towns or have a lot to them that are just going to kind of get put into a blender, right? Like even a Starkville and Oxford. What happens when Lane Kiffin leaves Ole Miss at some point, or Mississippi State kind of stays in this weird spot where they're not good? Well, now the Egg Bowl is just going to kind of be like, right, to the general public, or may lose its luster. But that's a Thanksgiving matchup that has some of the most intense moments. So yes, the college football playoff will have these arguments about conferences and all this, but we've lost the regionality that made the same argument interesting, because it'll just turn into who did you play, who did you beat, okay, cool, thanks. Like there's that intrigue will start to fade because the people who care about it, you're not going to be playing people you care about as often, and the times you do is so thick and thin. Like, you think Texas really cares about playing Vanderbilt?
Well, they'll be glad to
like
play Vanderbilt. They'll be
really glad to play Vanderbilt, but if you're their fans, would you rather them play Kansas State or even a Kansas, which I know is not, a complete equal equivalent, but are two teams that you have played way more, or even Texas Tech? Like you were losing those games, and the in between's going to get more boring, and everything else will kind of just become more of a mesh, and the big games will matter, and everything else will just kind of be When everything else, that middle to lower ground, is what made the top more interesting. Is knowing that Purdue can spoil an Ohio State run. That's more fun to me than even an Oregon-Ohio State game, even if one's a better football game.
Yeah, I mean that's what's going to be interesting. It is just one of those things where at the end of the day, this whole playoff, at the end of the day, it's a TV show, right? It's like this is controlled by the big four letters, and they are kind of the ones Mitch playing and Mash playing it, and at the end of the day, it came down to Florida State or Alabama, and Alabama's going to win that any day of the week. We have 2 minutes left on the Zoom here before we get kicked off here, Jerry. You know about rapping. So in your opinion, real quickly, you believe Florida State got screwed, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't. So, I mean, that's what's interesting about college football is we can sit here and argue that. And, in the 12-team playoff, Florida State would have got in. They would have got their chance. But the biggest thing is now moving forward, where Florida State already wanted to leave the ACC, this makes you want to leave even more.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where I think we're kind of hurting, like you said, the regionality, the form of it. And now it's like, well, Florida State's like, well, we get no respect in the ACC. We have to go. This is their only way. And in the long run, it's going to end up hurting them than it does help them. I think the other interesting thing is, I think if Deion Sanders is the coach of Florida State, they're in the playoff. I wholeheartedly believe that. Texas would have been moved out. Alabama would have been in, because they would have made the argument Alabama beat the number one team we thought, and Florida State would be 3. They'd be playing Washington. That's what I believe, and that is what makes this a flawed system where you have 13 people in a room in Texas.
Yeah, and it's what stinks is Norvell, I think, is a great coach who has a great story too. And yes, if he's Deion Sanders, he's probably in. Norvell took over that program. They were very mid, right? Ever since Jimbo left, they have not looked the same. He came in, had an inspiring team that, I don't care if they didn't look as good on paper, won every single game. Yeah. And if they leave the ACC and let's say they jag in Clemson, they're going to become a part of that mush where everything in below the top becomes mush. And it's not going to be fun because it's just going to be a bunch of random matchups that you don't care about if you're a fan of a team within the mush. It's a thing I worry about. As much as Missouri's been great this year, we might be a part of the mush. I want to play Kansas. I want to play teams I care about. And I hope that this is a one-off with the playoff, because it can determine a lot about what the future of the sport looks like. And it could be really bad for a lot more fans than it is the ones who get to benefit from it.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting. Jerry, thanks for joining me. It's been good to talk to you, an SEC guy, because, it just means more at the end of the day.
And for the ACC, it just means less.
That's pretty much what we were told. That's going to do it. Thanks for watching, everybody.